The box was smaller than anyone expected, unimpressive pine, scuffed at the corners, a relic you'd pass by in a crowded archive without a second glance. Yet the seal across its lid stopped the graduate student's hand cold, a brittle ribbon of red wax, impressed with an 1847 stamp and a line of brown ink script that felt less like a label than a warning. May God forgive what men have done. She didn't laugh at the melodrama. She didn't call for a colleague to come film a discovery moment. She only stood very still in the chilly reading room of the South Carolina Historical Society, listening to the hum of the dehumidifiers and the distant footfalls of a docent, and understood some doors, once opened, changed the air on the other side. It hadn't been chance that brought her here in 2003. The questions had pulled her down from the surface for months, scattered mentions in county minutes of unusual injuries, a sheriff's expense for extra riders, as a faded newspaper paragraph about a planter's indisposition that somehow managed to say everything and nothing. There is a smell to covered history, camphor and starch, and the faintest tang of fear that no index can capture. And she had followed it into this room. The archivist cut the wax carefully. The lid lifted with a sigh of released dust. Inside a sheaf of depositions, a few letters, a folded memorandum in an elegant hand, and a thin bundle tied with twine, marked in the same cramped script, testimonies private. The first page looked ordinary enough. Georgetown, March 1847. Present Sheriff Benjamin Carr, Deputy Tolson, District Attorney H. Felder, Reverend Thomas Clayton. A proceeding in a courthouse chamber. A defendant unnamed in the heading. Identified only as male slave. Property of the Ruttled estate. Unable to give sworn verbal testimony on account of damaged vocal cords. A detail that would recur so often the student would come to dread its repetition. The prisoner nodded. A silence that was not ignorance, but injury. She turned the page and the pattern announced itself like a knife laid on a table. 8 men, all plantation owners, all attacked over 11 years, each found behind a locked door with the same mutilation, the same methodical efficiency. Each had said little. Officially, H refused, in the language of the record, to invite further scandal by pursuing open indictment. The state's paperwork did its soft, terrible work: misdirection, euphemism, burial. But the margins told their own story. The sheriff's hand grew more cramped as the years advanced. A name appeared and was crossed out, then penciled back in. In the minister's private note, kept here by accident or by stubborn mercy, there was a line that made the student lower the paper to steady her breath. I cannot condemn him. The law would hang him without hesitation. Yet what law protects him? Silas. The name arrives in a whisper. The transcripts pretend not to hear. Silas the Silent. The carpentered spectre moving between properties for tasks. Repair. Temporary labor. Never listed as guest. Never paid. Always locked away at night, like an object returned to a shelf. A boy who had once been brought to a plantation doctor with damage to larynx and vocal cords, cause undetermined, and then kept working because machines with broken bells still run. A man who learned the geography of other men's power, their doors, their weak hinges, their habits, their sleeping drafts, and who answered an unspoken system with a pattern as disciplined as it was dreadful. The student would later try to explain to her dissertation committee what it felt like to read those pages. And she would fail. How do you describe the experience of hearing 2 centuries speak at once, in the cool, institutional present fluorescent light? Quiet keyboards you read, the heat of 1836, a coastal August night buzzing with insects, a wife waking to a strange stillness beside her, a doctor summoning his training to name the unnameable. You feel the plantation class's fear thickening paragraph by paragraph, extra locks, pistols under pillows, sermons hinting at vigilance, and beneath it all, the low murmur in the quarters, the coded language moving like water through the ditches someone is making men pay. Not a rebellion with drums, but a tide, not a blaze, but a blade so controlled it leaves the house standing. What the official sheets never say outright. The silences imply with a cruel clarity. Incidents in sheds after dark, visits that are not visits, an economy that reduces people to entries on ledger lines and then acts surprised when the ledger bleeds. The archive can hide motive behind phrases like rebellious disposition, but it cannot hide the geometry of harm. Who could lock a door, and who could not? Who could call a lawyer, and who could only nod? Whose bodies were used, and whose reputations required immaculate fictions? Honor, they called it, in a world where rape had no name, only routine. The video you're watching does not exist to savor the lurid. It exists because history takes bribes. The bribe may be a euphemism, a sealed box, an agreement among powerful men that nothing is to be gained by stirring that up. The cost is always paid by the voiceless. The sealed packet in the pine box private was not private for protection of the public. It was private for protection of a caste story about itself. And so this episode begins, where theirs tried to end with the record that almost succeeded in burying a pattern of revenge precise enough to look like ritual, and a survivor's life that the system declared unworthy of narrative except as case closed. Outside the archive, Charleston is all postcard angles and pastel bravado, tall steeples, ironwork balconies, sweetgrass baskets coiled like patient time. In 1847, the city already knew how to pose. Tourists today follow walking tours that step lightly past what they'd rather not feel underfoot. But if you listen, if you let the old humidity rise from beneath the cobblestones, you can hear the low country as it was when rice ruled every breath, tidal gates opening and closing like iron lungs, bodies standing knee-deep in water until the skin macerated and the bones hummed with fever. Tasks measured out like prayers that never end. The document doesn't describe that exhaustingly, because it doesn't need to. It was the weather of the time. You only notice the weather when it breaks. The break begins with a man no one thought to fear because he could not summon sound. He learned by watching. One WPA interview would claim a century later, an old voice reaching back, watching the patrols, watching the keys, watching which windows stuck on humid nights, learning which men came to the sheds and which wives took laudanum to sleep through the night, learning that a door locked to keep you out might also serve to keep a secret in. In a system allergic to looking directly at its own reflection, invisibility can be power if you survive long enough to use it. But before the pattern, before the first cut, there is a boy on a plantation ledger, the size of a preacher's Bible, 1,822 field hand. Small tasks, 1828 damage to larynx, discipline incident. There is a mother, Patience, whose name reads like a dare to Providence, and whose death by fever occupies exactly the same length of ink as a broken plough. There is the casual arithmetic of a society that calls itself Christian while training children to say yes sir with a bruised throat. The student in 2003 understood that the most honest sentence in the box was also the shortest. The prisoner nodded. In that nod lives a decade of nights. In that nod lives the unfiled screams. A channel like this one cannot fix what the record keeper's untold. What it can do is hold the paper in the light long enough for the ink to redarken, for edges to sharpen, for the contour of the pattern to emerge in relief. It can set the stage so that when we step back into 1836, you can feel the humid air press against your ribs, the measured tread of a sheriff who doesn't yet know he is walking a circle, the falter in a minister's faith when he realizes the only way to be righteous here is to become disloyal. We will not decorate the brutality. We will not blink away from it either. So we begin not with the night of the final capture, not with the eighth man's howl behind a gag, but with paper and dust and a warning old enough to be your great-great-grandfather. May God forgive what men have done. It is less a plea than a verdict, because in the pages that follow, God's forgiveness will be the only kind available. The other kind, the human kind, the legal kind, had no place to live in a world where the law itself consecrated the injury. What comes next is a descent. Yes, but also a reckoning. A story of a man who took the only measure of control the world left him and carved it into his enemies' bodies. Not to kill them, but to break the lie that made them unassailable. 8 locked rooms. One silent witness who would no longer ask permission to be heard. Now turn the page with me. The year is 1836. The first man still thinks his bedroom is a fortress. The sheriff still believes locks mean safety. And Silas, the one the record tried to keep nameless, has already learned how to open what the world insists must remain shut. The South Carolina Low Country in 1836 was the kind of beauty that kills quietly. From a distance, it looked like paradise. The river plains shimmered with emerald rice fields. Cypress trees stood like cathedral pillars, and the air was thick with the hum of summer. But to live inside that landscape was to breathe a different truth, one of sweat, decay, and human suffering carefully hidden beneath the elegance of the planter class. The plantations along the Waccamaw, Pee and Black Rivers formed a world unto themselves. Tidewater flooded in and out twice each day, feeding the rice that made Charleston's gentlemen rich, and the rest of the world called them civilized. Yet for every acre that glittered beneath the sun, there were dozens of people bent waist-deep in water, cutting and bundling stalks under a feverish haze of mosquitoes. The workers were called hands. The language was deliberate, not people, not men and women, but hands, as though their humanity ended at the wrist. By the 1,830 seconds, the wealth extracted from these hands had made the Low Country one of the most profitable slave economies in North America. Some plantations counted 200 or 300 enslaved laborers. Most owners never dirtied their boots in the fields. Overseers managed the violence that kept the system intact: whips, iron collars, and confinement. It wasn't cruelty for cruelty's sake. It was control by design. White men feared the arithmetic of their own creation. In many districts, the enslaved outnumbered them 30 to 1. Every plantation ball, every church service, every polite conversation in Charleston parlors took place beneath the unspoken tension that one spark, one uprising, could set the entire coast aflame. That tension was the invisible heartbeat of the world Silas was born into. The Ruttled plantation sat a few miles inland from Georgetown, bordered by salt creeks that gleamed silver under the moon. The main house was grand by local standards, 2 stories of white clapboard, flanked by live oaks draped in Spanish moss. It looked peaceful, even graceful, but its foundations were laid over a graveyard of bones. The people who made the rice grow lived half a mile away in a cluster of shanties that barely deserved the name quarters. Each was a single room of pine boards, with gaps wide enough for rain to slice through. The smell of smoke, sweat, and mildew never left the air. Children were born there, grew up there, and unless soul died there. Silas was one of those children. The plantation ledger lists him without ceremony: patience female, field hand child, mulatto, male, no surname, no father's name, only that single word mulatto, a brand that told everyone who saw it that somewhere behind his mother's suffering stood a white man who would never be recorded. In that world, whiteness wrote the law, blackness bore its cost. The child of a white father and an enslaved mother carried double punishment, despised by the enslavers for his mixed blood and envied, sometimes resented, by those who shared his bondage but saw the pale skin that marked him as a living reminder of violation. Patience worked in the fields until her lungs gave out. She was known, according to oral accounts gathered decades later, for singing hymns in a soft, unbroken voice while she harvested rice. That voice was the only inheritance she could give her son. Silas learned early to stay near her shadow, to keep quiet, to watch. The quarters were a place of motion: babies crying, dogs barking, the thud of whips from the fields, but Silas moved through it like a small ghost. By the time he was 7, he was already helping carry water to the workers. At 10, he was binding stalks with bleeding fingers. Plantation life didn't offer childhoods. It only offered tasks, measured by the overseer's ledger. Yet those who remembered him years later described something unusual: a boy who learned by looking instead of speaking, who seemed to understand things without being told. That boy's eyes, one elderly man said in 1937, they'd go right through you. Didn't matter if you was white or black. He saw things you wished he didn't. The plantation system in the Low Country was built on what was called the task system. Each enslaved person was assigned a certain quota of work each day: a field to hoe, a ditch to dig, a set amount of rice to thresh. When it was done, the time left was technically theirs. That was the lie that kept many from collapsing. They used those stolen hours to tend small gardens, fish in the creeks, or carve trinkets they could trade. Freedom, in scraps. For Silas, those hours became something else, his apprenticeship in invisibility. When he was finished with his work, he sat near the storehouse or the docks, silently watching the overseer's movements, learning who drank, who lingered in the women's quarters after dark, who carried the keys. The ability to read men was a kind of survival. Charleston society liked to imagine itself a world apart from the fields refined. They said, cultured. Every Sunday, carriages rattled down Meeting Street carrying families to church, the women's skirts rustling like banners of virtue. Yet even there, in polished pews, the wealth that paid for the organs and stained glass came from the same mud-stained hands that worked the rice. The sermon spoke of obedience and providence. The Lord ordains all stations. One minister preached in 1835, and to rebel is to sin. The men who owned plantations nodded in agreement, secure in the belief that their hierarchy mirrored heaven's. But outside those sanctuaries, fever and hunger whispered a different gospel, one of endurance and the faint, dangerous hope that justice might someday wear human skin. In the quarters, night was the only time voices could rise above the day's commands. Songs drifted through the air, carrying meanings that overseers never heard, rhythms that mapped escape routes, words that remembered Africa. Silas would sit beside the fire, eyes reflecting the flames, listening. He couldn't have known then that his own silence would become its own kind of language, one that white men would one day learn to fear. The year 1828 arrived with no sign that history was turning. The rutled plantation ledger that autumn mentions a single event that, to its writer, meant little slave boy, approximately 13 years, injury to throat, cause undetermined. The notation sits between entries about a broken plow and a purchase of sugar. But for Silas, it was the moment his world narrowed to a whisper. The official record offers no explanation, a doctor's brief recommendation of observation, a second-hand noting discipline incident. Plantation language was designed to obscure. Discipline might mean a whipping, a branding, or something worse. What exactly happened to the boy named Silas that left his vocal cords shredded? No one outside the Rutled estate would ever write down, but the silence that followed became legend. Neighbors would later remember seeing him working again within weeks, his neck wrapped in linen, his lips moving but producing only a faint rasp. Overseers found it convenient, a worker who could not complain, could not shout warnings, could not testify. They nicknamed him the Quiet One. Within the quarters, the name shifted. The elders whispered Silas the Silent, with the respect reserved for things not fully of this world. Some said he had seen something the day he was punished, something so vile that the Lord himself took his voice to keep the secret from killing him. Whether divine or deliberate, that injury transformed him. In a society where speech invited whipping and truth invited death, silence was a shield. He began to use it the way others used tools as protection. As these guys, when overseers spoke freely in front of him, believing him harmless, he listened. When they discussed punishments or affairs with the master's wife, he remembered. His quiet became a kind of power, invisible to those who mistook silence for obedience. Across the low country, the balance between fear and control trembled like the surface of a swamp. The Denmark-Vesey conspiracy of 1822 still haunted white imaginations, the idea that the enslaved might coordinate, might think, might act with purpose. Every whispered rumor of rebellion sent patrols galloping through the night. Curfews tightened. Passes were required to walk even between plantations, and anyone caught with a book or a scrap of writing faced mutilation or death. To speak, to read, to remember, each was rebellion. And in that world, a boy who could not speak learned instead to watch everything. By 1836, Silas had become part of the machinery, a skilled field hand, sometimes loaned to neighboring estates. His silence made him efficient. unthreatening, forgettable. He belonged to the system so completely that no one saw he was already studying how to break it. And so, as the summer heat swelled over the swamps, the stage was quietly set. The rivers flowed golden under the evening sun. The church bells of Charleston rang across the marshes, and in a small, rough cabin at the edge of the ruttled fields, a man who could not speak lay awake, listening to the sound of distant laughter from the big house. Each echo reminded him that there were words he would never again be allowed to say, and men who would never stop taking until someone made them bleed. The first opportunity was coming. The first door, the first blade, the first reckoning. The year was 1836, and the silence was about to move. Before the first scream was ever stifled behind a locked door, before Silas became the whisper that white men feared, there was a single night in October 1828 that changed everything. The ledger says discipline incident. Nothing more. No explanation. No witness. No apology. But fragments survive not on paper, but in stories retold through 3 generations, reshaped by memory and fear. They say the overseer's name was Craven, a man who drank hard and carried a short whip plated with lead wire. They say he caught a boy near the storehouse after dusk, accused him of stealing. Maybe Silas had only been curious, or maybe he'd seen something he wasn't meant to see. Craven forcing a young woman against the wall, a sight that demanded silence to survive. Whatever the truth, the night ended with the sound of breaking wood and a cry that barely rose above a whisper before it was cut off completely. When morning came, the field hands found Silas lying near the trough. Blood dried across his chin. The doctor from Georgetown examined him briefly, pressed a hand to his throat, and wrote, "Damage to larynx and vocal cords, cause undetermined." The words were tidy, the wound was not. From that day forward, he spoke only in fragments of sound, half-formed grunts, whispers that scraped the air. Some said it made him less than human. Others, mostly the women in the quarters, said the boy had seen hell and come back with its silence in his mouth. In plantation society, a voiceless slave was convenient. He couldn't call for help, couldn't testify, couldn't lead. Overseers treated him as background, the way they ignored the rustle of leaves or the hum of insects. But there was something in his stare that made even the cruel ones uneasy. His grey eyes, that anomaly inherited from a father no one dared name, carried a stillness that didn't belong in a place where everything screamed. For Silas, the world became an ocean of sound without speech. He learned to listen like others breathe. The soft creak of the overseer's saddle told him when to move. The change in the rhythm of the frogs at night warned him when patrols approached. The whisper of footsteps on the packed earth taught him who walked with guilt. He began to understand people through their noise, not words, but what lived beneath them. He was 15 when his mother, Patience, died of fever. The burial took place behind the quarters in a patch of ground no owner ever visited. The preacher read the same verses he read for every funeral. His voice detached, practiced. Silas stood alone after everyone left, staring at the mound until rain flattened it into mud. The next day, he returned to work, and no one mentioned her again. That was the rule. Pain existed, but not officially. In that silence, something grew inside him, not rage exactly, but an awareness of what silence could do. It could hide, protect, wait. The Low Country in those years pulsed with paranoia. After the Vasey scare, Charleston's white citizens had convinced themselves that every prayer meeting was a conspiracy. Laws multiplied like weeds, no literacy for slaves, no unsupervised worship, no movement after dark without papers. Patrol riders scoured the roads, lanterns swinging, pistols drawn, looking for signs of rebellion. But what they never understood was that rebellion doesn't always shout. Sometimes it studies, sometimes it learns to pick locks, sometimes it smiles when spoken to and waits. Silas's work changed after his voice was taken. He was too young for field gangs and too damaged for public tasks that required shouting or singing. The overseer sent him to help in the carpentry shed, where enslaved men built furniture, repaired tools, and shaped the wooden parts of rice mills. There, he found precision, measuring, cutting, fitting. The quiet rhythm of making things fit together was a language he could still speak. He learned fast. Within a year, he could plane a door straight and rebuild a broken latch with nothing but a file and scraps of metal. It was here he began to understand locks, how they clicked, where they failed, what tools they feared. At night, when the shed was closed, he stayed behind under the pretext of cleaning. The overseer liked a quiet worker and never asked questions. Silas used those hours to practice disassembling small padlocks, tracing their tumblers with the tips of his fingers until he could feel their secrets. He didn't know yet why he was doing it, only that it gave him control in a world built to deny him any. By 1832, the Untold plantation was thriving again after a poor harvest. The master's sons returned from Charleston College, proud of their studies and their property. With them came parties, nights of laughter spilling from the big house, of candles burning in upstairs windows while the quarters lay dark. The sound carried over the rice fields, mocking and constant. Silas, now a thin young man with calloused hands and watchful eyes, became one of the trusted slaves occasionally sent to assist during these events. He served wine, carried trays, stood invisible beside men who discussed politics and profit as though the human bodies around them were furniture. One night, he followed his master's order to fetch something from the storage room near the rear veranda. Inside, he found not tools but terror, a young enslaved boy, no more than 12, tied to a beam, trembling and half-dressed. A white man, drunk, stumbled nearby, muttering threats. Silas froze. Unseen, the man's face glowed red under the candlelight. One of the guests from Charleston. Silas turned and left without a sound, but that image stayed with him like a scar. That was the first time he understood the pattern. The overseers, the guests, the masters, their cruelty wasn't random. It was routine, protected by silence like his own, but theirs chosen, not forced. They could confess it to no one, and so they simply repeated it. And now there existed, within their system, one silent witness who could see everything and be dismissed as nothing. In 1834, the plantation's new manager began renting out skilled labor to nearby estates. It was profitable and common practice. Carpenters, blacksmiths, seamstresses loaned for a fee. Silas's silence made him ideal for this trade. He was obedient, efficient, and incapable of gossip. By 20, he had worked on 6 plantations across the low country, moving through them like a ghost. Each new place taught him more: how different houses locked their windows, how masters carried their keys, how some men visited the slave quarters when the moon was high. And in every new plantation, the same unspoken pattern repeated: men of power descending into the dark to take what was theirs by law but not by right. Every assault hidden behind etiquette and religion, every bruise written off as the will of God. Silas watched and learned. Somewhere between those journeys, his silence stopped being a wound and became a weapon. He discovered that when men assume you cannot speak, they forget you can think. They talk freely. They betray themselves. And once a man reveals himself, he can be destroyed. In the rice fields, the air was heavy with malaria and rot. Men and women sang work songs in voices too tired to rebel. The summer heat shimmered above the flooded paddies. Silas bent to his task like the rest, but his mind was elsewhere on the sheds, the keys, the way a latch could be lifted quietly if you pressed against the wood just right. Somewhere deep inside, the shape of an idea began to form, not yet revenge, but correction, to balance what could never be forgiven. A system built on violence could only be answered in its own language. The first opportunity came quietly, the way storms begin as a shift in wind. It was August. Essentially, Silas had been sent to help repair a rice mill on the neighboring Grayson plantation. He slept in a storage shed near the main house, locked each night from the outside. The master, Nathaniel Grayson, was a man of refinement by local reputation, polite in company, generous in charity, a model of Southern grace. But those who lived under his roof knew the truth. That evening, Grayson had visited the shed after dark. He left 30 minutes later, adjusting his clothes. Silas said nothing, could say nothing, but something inside him had shifted. That night, for the first time since his voice was taken, Silas prayed not for salvation, but for balance, for silence to become sound. Within 24 hours, the first reckoning would come. The night air of August 1836 pressed thick against the rice fields, heavy with the scent of mud and river decay. The Grayson plantation slept beneath its canopy of moss, unaware that its master was about to wake into a nightmare. Inside the main house, Nathaniel Grayson dreamed the kind of dream only men who believe themselves untouchable can have filled with triumph, not remorse. He was a man of standing, 32 years old, the son of a Charleston merchant, as a husband to a delicate woman who smiled in public and wept in private. By all accounts, he was respected, the kind of man invited to dine with judges and pastors. Yet behind the mask of gentility, Grayson harbored a hunger he fed in silence, one protected by law and sealed by the obedience of those he violated. Hours earlier, he had gone down to the shed where the lone carpenter slept. It was routine for him. He told himself these visits were rites, not crimes. The man inside was mute, damaged, docile, less than a man. No one would ever know. No one would ever believe a slave, let alone one who could not speak. At dawn, his wife found him in the bed, soaked red. The scream she let loose tore through the morning mist and woke the entire house. Servants rushed in, froze, and turned pale. The plantation doctor arrived within the hour, summoned from Georgetown by a rider who nearly broke his horse to reach him. He would later write in his report, "Wound inflicted with surgical precision, no evidence of struggle. Entry impossible to determine." The bedroom door had been locked from the inside, the windows shut, latched, untouched. There were no footprints, no broken glass, no weapon. It was as though the act had come from within, an invisible retribution that required no entrance. Sheriff Benjamin Carr rode in before noon, his boots still wet from the swamp crossings. He'd seen murders, runaways, punishments that ended in death, but never this. 8 men surrounded Grayson's bed, doctor, overseer, relatives, each whispering theories that evaporated the moment they were spoken. A runaway slave, impossible, all were accounted for. A jealous husband, unthinkable. Plantation society depended on polite blindness, not scandal. Some muttered the word curse. Carr inspected the windows himself, ran a finger along the latch, found dust undisturbed. When he questioned the enslaved people, their eyes stayed on the ground. The patrols dragged the fields for days, whipping men for imagined confessions. Nothing. And as quickly as the investigation began, it died. The Graysons wanted silence more than justice. To acknowledge what had happened meant inviting the wrong questions. A plantation owner unmanned in his own bed, better to call it accident, or providence, or madness. What the sheriff didn't know, what he never learned, was that on the previous evening, the ruffled overseer had sent one of his workers to assist at the Grayson mill, a thin, quiet carpenter named Silas. He'd been given a corner of the tool shed to sleep in, locked in for safety, they said. The overseer saw no harm in keeping him there overnight. The following morning, after the screams, Silas was found in the same shed, the lock still fastened from the outside. He was released, told to return to Rutland. His eyes never left the ground. No one thought to ask him anything. What could a mute man say? Within a week, the story faded from conversation. White society learned to treat it as grotesque gossip, something best not repeated at supper. The Graysons stayed indoors. Their servants walked softly, and the whispers began quiet. Dangerous whispers among the enslaved in nearby plantations. Someone made him pay. That phrase, "made him pay," became its own form of scripture in the quarters. No one said names, but everyone knew the pattern when justice will not speak. Vengeance sometimes learns how. For Silas, life continued as though nothing had happened. Back on the Rutland estate, he worked in the carpentry shed, hammering, mending, planing boards smooth. His movements never changed. He didn't gloat, didn't tremble, but those who looked closely noticed his silence had deepened not just the absence of speech, but a kind of inner quiet that made others uneasy. He had crossed a line that most men never see, the thin seam between survival and transformation. If he felt guilt, he never showed it. Perhaps there was none to feel. In a system that permitted every cruelty but punished resistance as sin, morality was a language written in chains. By September, plantation gossip settled. Sheriff Carr wrote his final note: no suspects. No further inquiry recommended. The entry vanished into the courthouse archives, filed beside reports of stolen cattle and minor debts. Yet something in the Low Country had changed. Grayson's neighbors began installing extra locks on their doors. A few hired night guards. A few whispered about demons. The rest prayed. 2 months later, Silas was sent again, this time to the plantation of a man named Thomas Wainwright, 12 miles to the south. The task was small: repairing an outbuilding, replacing a gate. The job should have lasted 3 days. On the second night, Wainwright visited the tool shed. He left before dawn, and 3 days later, Wainwright's overseer found him bleeding on the floor of his office, unable to speak a word. The wound was identical. The door had been locked from the inside. By now, fear moved faster than the tide. A sheriff's report circulated through Georgetown and Charleston, warning of repeated attacks of unnatural savagery. But the authorities still refused to connect the dots. To admit a pattern was to admit that their world could be penetrated by the very people they claimed to own. The illusion of control had to remain absolute. The only ones who understood were those who lived beneath that illusion. In the quarters, stories bloomed in the dark. A man with eyes like storm clouds, who spoke to no one but saw everything. A man who could pass through doors without opening them. A man who made white men tremble in their own beds. They called him the Silent One. Some said he was a ghost. Others said he was flesh and blood, vengeance walking on 2 legs. Silas heard the whispers but never reacted. He didn't need faith or legend. He had memory. Every nail he hammered, every door he repaired, every latch he touched taught him how fragile the idea of safety truly was. After the second attack, the Low Country entered a new phase of dread. Owners stopped renting out strangers. Overseers doubled the patrols. Yet the fear they tried to suppress only made the nights longer. Even the insects seemed to hum lower, as if the land itself was holding its breath. And somewhere, in a carpenter's shed lit by a single lantern, Silas sharpened his tools. He was not done. He was only beginning to speak in the only language they had left him. The silence that had once been forced upon him was now his signature. Each cut, each locked door, each trembling man was a word in a new vocabulary of justice, one that did not ask permission, one that did not require sound. The Low Country would never be the same again. By 1838, the Low Country had become a landscape of whispered dread. The marshes still shimmered at sunrise. The rice still rippled gold under the heat. But beneath the surface, beneath the white columns and the Sunday sermons, something had cracked. 2 men of standing had been mysteriously injured in their own homes. Both survived. Both refused to speak. Both withdrew from public life. And both, though no one dared to say it aloud, had shared the same secret before their mutilation: a silent carpenter who passed through their plantations, working, watching, vanishing. The planters told themselves it was coincidence. They had to. To believe otherwise meant accepting that one of their own slaves had hunted them across miles of swamp and plantation road and succeeded. But among the enslaved, the truth circulated like current through water. It moved from field to field, carried in song and code. They called him the one who listens to the dark. Silas's legend grew quietly, like the moss on the live oaks, rooting itself into fear and hope alike. Sheriff Benjamin Carr was the only white man who felt the pattern beginning to form, though he could not or would not articulate it. Each report he filed was more guarded than the last. In public, he spoke of isolated acts. In private, he wondered how many more names would join the list. In March of 1838, the third case arrived. Thomas Wainwright, a church deacon and a man celebrated for his moral conduct, was found in his plantation office, collapsed over his desk. The doctor noted the same cold precision of injury, the same impossible locked door. Carr began to ride the roads at night, lantern swinging at his side, stopping at plantations to ask questions that owners pretended not to hear. "Have you rented out skilled laborers from the Ruttled estate?" he'd ask. Some would pause, then say, "Yes, a carpenter." Maybe. Couldn't recall his name. It was always the same description, light-skinned, grey-eyed, quiet. Carr took notes he'd later burn. He sensed the truth, but the truth could not live in ink. By 1840, 4 men lay broken in their beds. Each time the story was the same: a locked room, a clean cut, a survivor too ashamed to speak. And though the victims lived, something died in every house: a certainty, a hierarchy, an illusion of mastery. To outsiders, the Low Country still looked unchanged. Cotton skirts fluttered on porches, horses clopped down dusty lanes, and Charleston society carried on with its masquerade. But under that facade, the planter class began sleeping with pistols. They built stronger locks, bought heavier shutters, installed new bolts on doors that had never needed them before. The richer ones hired extra overseers, pretending it was about efficiency. In truth, they were afraid of their own shadows. It was not open rebellion, nothing that could be crushed by rifles and ropes. This was worse. It was personal, surgical, a vendetta too precise for their imagination to grasp. In the quarters, meanwhile, the story took on a rhythm almost spiritual. Women hummed songs about the silent hand, about a man who took from the wicked what they had stolen from others. To sing too loudly was death, but to whisper the melody by the fire brought a dangerous kind of hope. An old woman named Hester, born before the Revolution, was said to have told the young ones, "Justice don't always come with thunder. Sometimes it come on soft feet, like a cat in the dark." Silas never claimed that name for himself, but he didn't reject it either. When he passed through a plantation and someone in the shadows whispered the silent one, he'd lower his eyes, never smile, never confirm. But his hands would tighten ever so slightly on the handle of his hammer. The hammer was always clean. The blade, hidden among his carpenter's tools, sharper than law. If there was any pattern in his vengeance, it was measured by opportunity. Silas struck only after a man had taken from him, or from others like him, what could never be returned. The first two were personal. The next were communal. In 1839, Edmund Talbot, an unmarried planter notorious for his indulgences, was found in his parlor, blood pooling beneath the piano. The sheriff noted no sign of forced entry. The plantation's enslaved population was questioned, beaten, whipped. 3 died before Carr ordered the punishment stop. He knew they were useless. Whoever was doing this moved with the precision of someone who understood not just locks and houses, but fear itself. In 1840, Henry Prescott became the 4th. He was found the same way. Same wound. Same silence. His wife fainted when she saw him. The doctor wrote in his report, "The act performed by a steady hand, neither in haste nor frenzy." By now, Silas's travels had become routine. The Ruttled plantation rented him out frequently, often at the request of neighboring estates that needed repair work. He built, mended, measured. He slept in sheds that were locked each night and opened each morning by men who never looked into his eyes. He left nothing behind, no footprints, no fingerprints, only unease. The overseers who employed him always described him the same way: quiet, efficient, useful. But when asked about his eyes, most would pause. "Strange," they'd say, "like he's not looking at you, but through you." No one knew he kept notes of his own marks carved on the underside of his workbench back at Ruttled. 8 lines etched in neat pairs, each pair crossed with a single notch. 4 pairs were already complete. 4 more waited. The Low Country began to rot from within. Planters distrusted their servants. Servants distrusted their overseers. The line between power and panic blurred. Ministers preached about divine punishment, about sin festering within the righteous order. Some said the devil had taken a body and was moving among them. But in the quarters, the whispers turned almost reverent. "He's not devil," one woman said. "He's what come before mercy." When patrol riders questioned her later, she denied saying anything, because in that world, words could kill you, but silence could save you. The violence didn't spark rebellion, but it changed the air. You could feel it in the way overseers hesitated before raising their whips, in the way masters hesitated before walking unarmed after dark. The hierarchy no longer felt ordained, it felt temporary. And that, for Silas, was the point. He wasn't trying to end the system. He was trying to expose it, to make it feel itself, to show the masters what it was to live, always afraid of what might happen when the door locked from the inside. He never said those words, he couldn't, but he didn't need to. Each act was a sermon written in blood, preached to men who'd never listened to prayers that came from black throats. By the end of 1840, the Low Country knew his name but never spoke it. Plantation owners whispered about that silent devil, but never reported him officially. To admit the pattern was to confess their own crimes. And so, the silence that began as Silas's curse became his perfect camouflage. For every man he punished, dozens of others changed how they moved through the world. The order of plantation life, so carefully choreographed for decades, wavered. Doors that once opened freely to violence now closed early. Overseers who once strutted through the quarters at midnight now walked with torches and guns. Fear, at last, had learned to look both ways. And through it all, Silas continued his work steady. Percent. Invisible. Each board he nailed, each lock he examined, each plantation he left behind drew the circle tighter around those who still believed their power was divine. But vengeance cannot live without witnesses, and soon, someone would see him, someone who would understand both his silence and his purpose. By 1841, Silas had become a ghost that daylight could not explain. He worked openly, moved freely between plantations, and yet everywhere he went, unease followed like shadow. The Rutteld estate had discovered a lucrative trade in his silence. When other planters needed repairs, they sent for the mute carpenter. He was worth more that way, efficient, obedient, incapable of gossip. Each month, his labor earned the Rutteld family extra coin, and each time they sent him away, another master would fall within a season. Still, no one connected the pattern, because to do so meant facing a truth more horrifying than any murderer, that one of their own possessions could outthink them. The records from this period show that Silas was hired out at least 12 times between 1840 and 1842. He traveled from Georgetown to the Black River settlements, to the rice fields outside Conway, to the inland plantations near Kingstree, always alone, always returning without incident. He built fences, repaired porches, fixed broken mill wheels. He left behind flawless work and something unspoken. When the white men discussed business within earshot, they forgot that silence could listen. When they bragged about what they'd done in the dark, they forgot that darkness sometimes remembers. Silas didn't need words to take notes. He remembered everything: the shape of keys, the pitch of hinges, the smell of each man's cologne, the way they breathed when they lied. He studied fear like a trade. Plantation society had long relied on a paradox that the very people who built their houses would never dare to enter them without permission. It was an illusion. Silas dismantled one door at a time. While the overseers laughed over rum, he would run his fingers along window frames, feeling for loose catches. He examined locks as if they were puzzles meant only for him. He learned which rooms the masters used, which doors creaked, which wives took laudanum before bed. He mapped every plantation in silence, every hallway, every escape route, and when the night came, sometimes weeks later, sometimes months, he would use that map. No witness ever saw him move. But after each attack, the rumor grew. No dog barked, no glass broke. A man would fall asleep in his own house and wake up forever changed. Among the enslaved, Silas's legend reached a fevered pitch. They spoke of him in tones usually reserved for saints or storms. He was not hero or villain, but a force, the one who made things even. Old women whispered that he could walk through walls. Children were told to be silent at night, lest the quiet man hear them and mistake them for prey. But even in fear, there was admiration. For once, the terror belonged to someone else. On one plantation, a man was overheard saying, "The master's finally sleeping the way we do, scared of the dark." He was whipped before dawn for the comment, but the sentence had already spread. The Low Country was turning on itself. Reverend Thomas Clayton, the itinerant Presbyterian minister, had begun to notice, too. He served several parishes in the region, and each month, the prayer lists grew longer, names of planters requesting protection, wives asking for deliverance from evil. They spoke of a curse, a phantom, something unclean. Clayton, though cautious, sensed that this was no spirit. He heard hints of hired labor, of a silent man, of vengeance disguised as coincidence. He began keeping notes in a leather-bound journal, recording each injury, each whisper. Those journals would one day outlive all of them. Meanwhile, Silas continued to work. He rose before dawn, accepted his rations without complaint, nodded when addressed. He was the perfect employee until he wasn't. Every plantation he entered carried its own cruelty. Some masters were drunkards, others were worse. He saw women dragged from quarters under the pretense of discipline. He saw boys taken to barns and returned broken. He saw God invoked as excuse for everything. And in each place, he waited for the moment when the man responsible looked at him as if he were nothing. That look, the same one that had followed him since childhood, was always the last mistake they made. When Edmund Talbot fell in 1839, the Low Country panicked. When Henry Prescott joined him in 1840, panic hardened into paranoia. By 1842, Robert Finch and Charles Hammond made 6. The planters held secret meetings in Charleston drawing rooms, their voices low, their faces pale. They formed patrol committees, offered rewards, circulated sketches of escaped black males, none resembling the man who worked under their very eyes. They did not suspect Silas because they could not imagine him capable of thought, much less strategy. And so, they invited him back, again and again. For every plantation that feared the silent avenger, another rented him in ignorance. The Ruttled estate grew richer. Silas grew quieter. He no longer needed rage to move him. Habit was enough. Vengeance had become a kind of craft, a pattern repeated until perfect. He planned nothing in haste. When an owner visited his shed at night, he simply waited. Days later, he would inspect the house in daylight under the guise of repairs. Note the locks, the angles, the shadows. At night, he moved like breath itself. He didn't kill, death was too merciful. He wanted memory. He wanted them to wake, to live, to understand. The Low Country began to rot under that understanding, but the planter's silence protected him as much as his own. No one dared report the truth. To admit what these men had done to him to others was to destroy the illusion of white honor, so they let him walk free, even as they prayed for deliverance from the ghost they'd created. Silas was no ghost, but by now, he felt like one. He slept little, ate only enough to keep moving. His eyes had grown sunken, haunted, pale. People said he seemed half here, half elsewhere, as though he was already leaving the world that had hurt him. Soon, someone would see him, someone whose voice, unlike his, still carried weight, someone who could turn rumor into truth and truth into danger. Her name was Dina. Her name was Dina, born into bondage, raised between kitchens and corridors, and trained to serve without being seen. By 1842, she belonged to the Hammond plantation, 20 miles south of Georgetown, a house known for its hospitality to guests and its cruelty to those who kept it running. Dina was 34, thin, deliberate in her movements. Her hands were never still. They polished, folded, carried, and bowed. Yet her eyes missed nothing. In a place where silence meant safety, she had learned to see what others pretended not to. That year, Hammond's household had been in chaos. The master, Charles Hammond was anxious, more anxious than most. 6 men in the region had been attacked by unknown persons. The rumor of a silent avenger crept through drawing rooms like smoke. Hammond locked his doors at night, carried a pistol to bed, and blamed Yankee agitators for spreading unrest. When he hired a carpenter from the Untold plantation to repair the gallery rails and window frames, Dina didn't think much of it. Hired hands came and went. This one unsettled her. He was quiet, even for a slave, light-skinned, eyes the color of winter river water. He worked with precision, never resting, never smiling. The overseer said his name was Silas. Dina had heard it before, whispered in stories passed between plantations, stories of white men bleeding in their own beds. But stories travel faster than truth. She dismissed it, until the night she woke to footsteps. It was late past 2, maybe 3. The house was dark except for the faint glow of the embers in the kitchen hearth. Dina had risen to use the chamber pot when she heard it one soft creak on the staircase that led to the family bedrooms. She froze, candle trembling in her hand. The house had its own language. After years of service, she knew every board that groaned, every hinge that sighed. Those steps, those careful, measured steps did not belong to the master's wife or to any child. Someone was moving with the precision of a man who did not want to be heard. Dina moved to the kitchen doorway, shielding the flame behind her palm. The stairway was barely visible, a slash of darkness against darker walls. Then, a shape emerged, tall, lean, deliberate, a figure that paused midway up, listening for a heartbeat. She thought it was a thief. Then the candlelight brushed his face. Silas. Her breath caught. The carpenter who slept each night, locked inside the tool shed. The one whose voice had been stolen by cruelty. What was he doing in the main house? How had he escaped his chains? She watched him move, soundless as shadow, toward Hammond's bedroom. He reached the door, tested the latch with care, and slipped inside. The door closed behind him without a sound. Dina stood frozen, the candle flickering. Every instinct screamed to wake someone, to call for help, to flee. But something stopped her, a deep, old knowing born from years of surviving other men's midnights. She had seen Hammond visit the quarters too many times, choosing women like livestock. She had seen the bruises hidden under sleeves. She had heard the muffled sobs that followed, whatever was happening upstairs. Perhaps it was not evil. Perhaps it was the reckoning whispered about for years. So she did nothing. She blew out her candle, returned to her room, and waited in the dark. The house stayed silent through the night. No screams, no footsteps, no gunfire, only the sound of wind moving through the swamp grass outside. Just before dawn, faint moaning began from upstairs. By sunrise, Mrs. Hammond's shriek broke the silence. When the sheriff came, the story repeated itself, exactly: a locked room, an unbroken window, an unconscious man, the wound, the shame, the silence. Hammond survived, but something in him shattered. He refused to speak of it. When questioned, his wife fainted rather than answer, and the carpenter Silas was gone. He had returned to the Untold plantation before dawn, just as if nothing had happened. For Dina, the days after were a fever of fear and guilt. Each night, she dreamed of that moment, the candlelight on his face, the calm in his eyes. He had looked at her once, briefly, before vanishing up the stairs. It wasn't a look of threat, nor even of recognition. It was something stranger, a kind of silent asking, "Do you understand?" And she had. God help her. She had. She told no one. To speak was death. Hammond's paranoia doubled. The overseers lashed harder. The patrols swept the roads, but she said nothing. Silence protected her. And in that silence, she carried the secret that could have ended him, or all of them. Months passed. Then another name joined the list. November 1843. Daniel Merrick. He was different from the others, meaner, crueler, known even among the slaveholders for punishments too vicious to mention. His plantation, near the Waccamaw River, was a place where screams were part of the night air. Silas was sent there to build a new storage shed. 10 days of labor, 10 days of observation. On the third night, Merrick visited the carpenter's sleeping place. On the 10th, he was found in his office, bleeding and silent. The overseer said the devil had done it. The slave said justice had. Either way, it was the 7th attack in 11 years. For Dina, the silence grew heavier. She avoided the eyes of the other servants when Silas returned for more repair work months later. When she passed him in the hall, he did not look up, but she felt something, a strange recognition. A warning. Maybe gratitude. Their silence was mutual. Like a pact, neither had spoken. She knew he was dangerous. Yes, but she also knew the greater danger was in pretending the world he avenged did not exist. Every night she told herself she should confess, tell the reverend, tell the sheriff, end the killings. Yet each time she remembered Hammond's hands, Merrick's laughter, the bruises on the girls who served wine to the guests, and her tongue froze. Because how do you betray a ghost who punishes monsters? In the quarters, the whispers changed tone, no longer just fear, something close to reverence. The silent hand, they called him now, the one who cut sin out of the living. Children would press their faces into their mother's skirts when his name was spoken, as if the air itself could be listening, and sometimes the women would nod, quietly, solemnly, as though they knew him not as legend but as deliverance. By 1844, the line between story and scripture had vanished. Men in Charleston still mocked the idea of a slave surgeon of vengeance. But they slept badly. The wives lit extra candles and locked the doors themselves. And in the distance, across the waterlogged fields, lanterns burned late in the carpenter's shed. Silas's tools gleamed in that dim light, hammers, chisels, small blades polished to silver, not weapons, but instruments. He cleaned each one with care, wrapped them in cloth, and placed them in his wooden chest. 7 lines carved under his workbench, 1 space left, and miles away, Reverend Thomas Clayton, one of the few white men capable of seeing the truth, was about to hear from Dina. And when he did, the fragile balance of silence that had protected them all would begin to crack. By early 1844, the Reverend Thomas Clayton had already learned to read fear in polite voices. He was a man of faith in a place where the gospel had been rewritten to sanctify cruelty. Each Sunday he preached to 2 congregations, the white plantation families who sat straight-backed in the front pews, and the enslaved who gathered outside the windows, listening through the shutters for a mercy that was never meant for them. Clayton was not an abolitionist, not yet. He was a man divided, raised within the same system he had begun to doubt. He'd seen too much rot behind the whitewashed civility confessions murmured to him by plantation wives, rumors of discipline that left scars across children's backs. Still, he told himself his duty was to save souls, not to judge bodies. That illusion ended the day Dina asked to speak with him in private. It happened in the small chapel of the Hammond plantation, the same one where Charles Hammond now sat in the back pew every week. Silent, pale, eyes fixed on the floor. The meeting was improper by every social law, an enslaved woman summoning a white minister. But Clayton's curiosity overcame his caution. He dismissed the overseer, locked the door, and waited. Dina stood before him, hands trembling, but voice steady. "I seen something, Reverend." The words came haltingly, but each one struck like a hammer. She told him about the night she had woken to footsteps on the stairs. The figure, the candlelight, the face she would never forget. She did not name him at first, only said, "A man with eyes like storm water, the one who don't speak." She spoke of the silence, the open door, the master's screams at dawn. Clayton asked questions carefully, knowing the risk she took even by speaking. "Why tell me now?" he asked. Her answer was soft but unflinching, "Because there's going to be more." That single sentence changed everything. Clayton was a man of scripture, but there was no verse for what she described, no prayer for the kind of justice that bleeds. He left the chapel shaken, his mind caught between 2 horrors, the crimes of men like Hammond and the vengeance rising in their shadows. For weeks he wrestled with his conscience. If he reported Dina's confession, she would be tortured, maybe killed. If he stayed silent, the killings would continue. And yet, something in her words, in the quiet certainty with which she'd said, maybe this is the only way, haunted him. By the summer of 1844, Clayton made his choice. He began his own investigation, quietly, methodically, under the guise of ministry. When he visited plantations, he asked questions that seemed innocent. Have you had any unusual troubles, any sickness among the men? He listened not to the answers, but to the pauses. He sought out the enslaved who worked as carpenters, blacksmiths, and servants, those who moved unseen through the private spaces of the master's world. And everywhere he went, he heard fragments of the same story. A man without a voice, a man who appeared, worked, and vanished, a man who punished the wicked. Clayton's notes from that summer, written in cramped, cautious handwriting, still exist. In one entry, dated August 12, Itembabe Sujasi, he wrote, I have learned the identity of the one they seek, though they know not whom they seek. He is called Silas, property of the Untold estate, a carpenter of great skill who cannot speak, his voice destroyed by punishment as a boy. I have learned what was done to him then, and since, God forgive me, I cannot condemn him. He did not share these notes with the authorities. He knew what would happen if he did. Instead, he traveled deeper into the low country, following the faint trail of truth that history had tried to erase. At the Untold plantation, he posed as a preacher, offering scripture to the enslaved. He saw Silas once. From a distance, a thin man, head bent over a workbench, the sunlight catching the pale scar across his throat. Even from afar, Clayton felt the weight of that silence. It was not madness, he realized, but memory given form. In September, word spread that the Reverend was asking questions he shouldn't. Within weeks, he received a summons from Georgetown's Committee of Citizens, a polite phrase for a gathering of powerful men who kept order through fear. They met in a parlor thick with cigar smoke and suspicion. Planters sat in a circle, faces tight with irritation. One of them, Augustine Sheffield, spoke for the rest. We understand you've been speaking to the colored folk about delicate matters, Sheffield said, matters that don't concern the spiritual welfare of anyone. Clayton answered carefully, I've merely sought to understand why men of good standing live in such fear. That fear, Sheffield interrupted, comes from people forgetting their place, and it's made worse by men like you, Reverend, who ask questions instead of preaching obedience. The warning was clear. Another visit to the plantations, another conversation about the silent man, and he would be removed or worse. Clayton left the meeting shaken but unrepentant. He continued to write. Each night, by candlelight, he recorded what he'd learned in a private cipher only he understood. His final entry that year reads like confession. They call him monster, but I see in him the proof of their own damnation. Each act of violence he commits is a mirror held to the society that made him. The law would hang him, yet what law protects him? I preach redemption. But how do you redeem a world that refuses to hear the cry of the voiceless? By the time winter came, Clayton knew that he was being watched. Riders followed him after evening services. Letters from Charleston clergy arrived, warning him to cease troubling the peace of the region, but he kept his journals close, wrapped in oilcloth beneath the chapel floorboards. He could not stop what was coming, and in some deep, shameful part of him, he no longer wanted to. The system he served was devouring itself. If Silas was the blade, the plantation order was the hand that sharpened it. Silas, meanwhile, continued his grim pilgrimage. Those who saw him said he looked changed, thinner, quieter still, as if part of him had already crossed into the next world. The same people who had once mocked the idea of the silent hand now crossed themselves when they passed him, and when his shadow stretched long in the evening light, even the overseers turned away. For 11 years, he had moved like a spirit through the rice fields. Now, the circle was almost complete. There was one man left, A master, more powerful than all the others. A man who believed himself untouchable, who sat in the state legislature and wrote laws to keep others voiceless. His name was Jonathan Caldwell, and Silas was already on his way to him. March 1847, the South Carolina low country was drowning in humidity and dread. The rice fields shimmered with heat. The air itself seemed to whisper that something was about to end. Jonathan Caldwell's plantation stretched along the Black River 2,000 acres of green profit and silent suffering. He was 47, a man of politics and pride, a member of the state legislature and one of the wealthiest planters in the region. His confidence was unshakable, his cruelty legendary. He owned more than 60 enslaved people, commanded an overseer known for sadism, and boasted that no slave in my sight has ever dared to look me in the eye. He believed the rumors of a silent avenger were superstition, a slave's ghost story. That arrogance would cost him everything. In early March, Caldwell sent a letter to the Rutteld estate, requesting a carpenter for a month-long construction project, a new overseer's house and repairs to the slave quarters. He offered double the usual fee. The Rutteld manager agreed without hesitation. And so, on March 3, Silas was sent downriver. He arrived with his tools neatly wrapped in cloth, his expression empty, his silence as steady as ever. Caldwell's overseer, Horace Strickland, received him with suspicion. The man checked the locks on Silas's workshop twice each night, ensuring the mute would not escape. But he didn't know that Silas had long ago learned the pattern of keys and bolts, the same locks built by the same blacksmiths across every plantation in the Low Country. He waited. On the second night, Caldwell came to him. He always came. History repeats itself in the dark. Caldwell entered the workshop after the lamps had been doused, his boots leaving mud across the plank floor. He closed the door softly, muttered something words Silas could not hear and would not need to. The violation was not new, not shocking. It was routine. It was ritual. When he left, Silas stood motionless by the bench, blood hammering behind his eyes. He touched the scar at his throat and felt it pulse, as if memory itself were alive beneath his skin. Over the next 3 weeks, the visits continued too, sometimes 3 times a week. No one interfered. The overseer thought himself protecting Caldwell's privacy. The other enslaved people turned their eyes away, knowing that pity was a luxury that cost lives. But Silas was changing. He worked with the same mechanical precision, but the men who saw him in the fields began to whisper, "He's fading." His skin had gone pale, his eyes darker, almost hollow. He ate little. He slept less. At night, his tools gleamed brighter than the lanterns, and somewhere within that silence, something broke. On the night of March 24th, Caldwell came again, but this time, Silas was waiting for him, not as a victim, but as an executioner. When Caldwell entered, Silas moved with a calm that was almost gentle. The hammer struck once, sharp as a pistol crack, catching Caldwell at the base of the skull. The man collapsed, dazed but conscious. Before he could shout, Silas gagged him with a rag and bound his hands with rope pulled from the tool rack. Caldwell struggled, but the more he thrashed, the tighter Silas tied. Then Silas lit every candle in the room. The light glared against the walls, reflecting off the polished blades. It was bright, almost holy. Caldwell blinked through tears, and for the first time in his life, he looked up at a man he had called property and saw not fear, but purpose. What followed was not frenzy. It was ceremony. Silas worked as he always did, with care, precision, patience. He did not rush. He did not look away. He used the same surgical tools that had left 7 men alive and broken. Only this time, he wanted Caldwell to feel. The procedure lasted nearly an hour. Caldwell's muffled screams rattled the workshop, but no one came. The night patrols were far from the house, and Strickland slept in the overseer's quarters. When it was done, Silas cleaned the tools. One by one, with a cloth dipped in the basin, he placed them back in their chest. And then, for the first time in his life, He left the door unlocked behind him. He walked into the open yard, candlelight fading behind him, his hands still red but steady. He passed the slave quarters, rows of silent eyes watching from the shadows, none daring to speak, yet every one of them understanding. He kept walking until he reached the riverbank. The black river shimmered under a thin moon. Silas stood at the edge, staring into the dark water as dawn began to break. That was where Strickland found him. The overseer had gone to check the workshop and discovered the horror within Caldwell bound. Mutilated, soaked in blood, but alive. His screams carried across the fields. Men ran. They found Silas standing calmly at the water's edge, motionless, looking at the current. When Strickland shouted his name, Silas turned slowly. The overseer would later swear that the man's eyes looked empty, as though whatever soul had once lived there had already left. Silas did not flee. He did not resist. He simply looked at them and let the irons close around his wrists. Strickland would tell others later that it wasn't rage that haunted him, it was the silence. A silence so heavy that even the river seemed to stop moving. Caldwell survived. Barely. He was taken to Charleston for medical treatment and would live the rest of his life half a man, haunted by the eyes that had stared down at him through the candlelight. But for the first time, the authorities had their suspect, Sheriff Carr, who had investigated the first two mutilations more than a decade earlier, rode out to the Caldwell plantation. He had spent years haunted by the mystery he could not solve. Now, at last, he had a man in chains and an answer he might not want. The interrogation would begin the next morning, and for the first time, the truth about the Low Country's silent hand would be forced into the open. But even then, the question would remain, would anyone dare to write it down? March 26, 1847, Georgetown Courthouse. The morning light fell cold and colorless across the stone floor. The room smelled of ink, iron, and fear. Silas was brought in under heavy guard. Shackles clanked against his wrists and ankles, each link rubbing against the skin until it bled. He was thinner than the records described, almost translucent. His eyes sunk deep in their sockets. When they sat him down, he made no attempt to resist, no motion to defend himself. He simply stared at the wall as though the world beyond it mattered more than the one around him. Present in the room was Sheriff Benjamin Carr, now gray at the temples, District Attorney Harrison Felder, a man whose arrogance filled the silence like smoke, and, at Carr's request, Reverend Thomas Clayton, the only man who might reach the prisoner. The official record of that interrogation survives, locked in the archives of the South Carolina Historical Society. The handwriting is neat, the language sterile, but Clayton's personal journals tell what the transcript could not: the tension, the unease, and the unbearable recognition that what they were about to hear would tear apart everything they believed about justice. Carr began first. "Did you attack Jonathan Caldwell?" Silas did not lift his head. He nodded once. "Did you?" Carr hesitated on the word. "Castrate him?" Another nod. A long pause followed. The deputies shifted uncomfortably. Carr leaned forward, voice lower. "Have you done this before?" Silas raised his head. His eyes were steady, clear. He nodded again. "How many?" He held up both hands, 8 fingers spread wide. The room fell silent, except for the scratching of the clerk's pen. Felder spoke next. "Why? Why did you do it?" There was no answer, only the faint rasp of air through the ruined chords of his throat. That was when Clayton stepped forward. "He cannot speak," he reminded them softly. Then, turning to Silas, he knelt, bringing his face level with the man in chains. "Silas," he said gently, "can you understand me?" A nod. Clayton took out a piece of paper and a pencil. "Can you write?" Silas shook his head. So Clayton began asking questions differently, shaping them into fragments that could be answered with nods and shakes. What followed was not a confession, it was revelation. "Did these men hurt you?" Silas nodded. "All of them?" A slower nod this time. "Did they force you?" His eyes closed. His head bowed. Another nod. "Did this begin when you were a boy, when your voice was taken?" The nod came again, and with it a tremor that passed through his entire body. Clayton swallowed hard. Did anyone ever try to stop them? Silas shook his head. Did you do this because no one else would? For the first time, Silas met his gaze directly. He didn't move, didn't nod, but in that stare lay every answer. Carr's hand trembled as he reached for the water glass. The truth sat heavy in the air, too heavy to speak aloud. He understood now what he had refused to see for a decade, the pattern, the silence, the shame that had hidden everything in plain sight. He turned to Felder. We could have found this years ago, he said quietly, if we'd looked. Felder bristled. Looked for what? For a slave's vengeance, Sheriff. This is simple. He mutilated 8 white men of standing. The law says he hangs. The law, Carr muttered, never asked why. They argued in low voices while Silas sat unmoving, eyes fixed on the floor. Clayton broke the silence again. If you hang him, he said, you hang every truth you've just heard. You bury it all over again. Felder's voice snapped like a whip. There will be no trial, no jury, no public spectacle. You understand what would happen if this gets out, if people learn why these men were attacked, if every plantation wife in the county learns what her husband's been doing in the sheds at night. Carr said nothing. The district attorney didn't need him to answer. By evening, the decision was made. The official report would record that Silas, property of the Ruttled estate, confessed to 8 counts of aggravated assault, motivated by rebellious temperament. There would be no mention of sexual violence, no acknowledgement of what had been done to him, no trial, no defense, no appeal. The record would close the matter. The execution would be quiet. The truth would be sealed, literally inside a leather-bound file, locked away in the courthouse archive, under orders of restricted access. But Reverend Clayton could not let it go. In the days before the scheduled hanging, he visited Silas twice in his cell. The first time, he sat across from him in silence for nearly an hour. The chains clinked softly when Silas shifted, but he made no attempt to speak. When Clayton offered him food, he refused. When asked if he wished to pray, he shook his head. At last, Clayton whispered, "You did what the world would never do for you." Silas looked up, and the faintest sound escaped his throat, not a word, but something like a sigh. On the second visit, Clayton brought a pencil and a small piece of paper. "If you cannot speak, perhaps you can show me," he said. "Is there anything you want remembered?" Silas took the pencil slowly. His hands shook, but he began to draw. The first image was of a child's face, mouth open, eyes wide. The second was a hand covering that mouth. The third was darkness. Below them, he scratched 8 crosses into the page, pressing so hard the pencil tore through. Then he set it down and slid it back across the table. Clayton took the paper and whispered, "I'll keep it safe." Silas nodded once. It was the last thing he ever did. The execution was scheduled for April 15. At dawn, 2 days before, guards found him dead in his cell. The report called it suicide by hanging, using strips torn from his blanket, but the details didn't fit. The cell was under watch, the rope too thick, too carefully knotted. Some said he was silenced to keep the secret safe. Others said he chose to leave before they could make a spectacle of him. Whatever the truth, the result was the same. No trial, no witness, no last words, only silence, perfect, final, complete. He was buried in an unmarked grave behind the courthouse. Among the nameless dead, no sermon, no stone, only the wind through the reeds, and the faint, endless hum of insects over the marsh. The 8 men who had survived his vengeance lived on as broken monuments to the world that made him. One moved north, one drank himself into ruin. One, too ashamed to face the whispers, vanished entirely. The others remained, limping through the years, each one haunted by the same unspoken truth. They had created the ghost that punished them. Reverend Clayton resigned from his parish 5 years later. He left for Pennsylvania and never returned to the South, but he carried with him a trunk of journals, sealed and hidden from public view for more than a century. It was in those pages yellowed and nearly forgotten that the story of Silas the Silent survived. When the archives were finally opened in 2003, a graduate student named Michelle Torres found them. Her hands shook as she read the last line in Clayton's handwriting. He made them listen, though he had no voice. No monument marks Silas's grave. No textbook tells his story. Yet his silence still echoes through the moss-draped trees of the Low Country, a silence heavier than any scream. A reminder of what happens when suffering is ignored until it learns to speak in blood. If you've watched this far, you already know some histories aren't written in ink. They're carved in scars. And sometimes, the silence itself is the loudest testimony of all.